Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining 2020, an exploration of wellness during a pandemic with Miss Colleen Crockford. For those of you who don't recognize my voice or know me, I'm Nicole Cass, the CE Program Manager for the MVMA, and today's moderator. A reminder that you are invited to submit questions at any point during the session in the Q&A area. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Colleen Crockford is a Master's of Social Work and a licensed social worker and has spent over 15 years working in small and large nonprofits across the Twin Cities and surrounding areas. Fusing big picture ideas with day-to-day work is her specialty. Colleen thrives in building programs that can effectively reach their goals and motivate others to join in their cause. She specializes within the veterinary field in the areas of compassion fatigue and grief and loss. Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks, Nicole. That was a really fancy introduction. Usually I just introduce myself. I'm going to hire you from now on. So as Nicole said, we're going to talk today about kind of the year we've been experiencing and looking at it through a wellness lens and a few other lenses. Since Nicole did a really good job introducing me, oops, I'm not sure if I can, doesn't want to let me advance my slide. That's not great. See, there we go. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. As she said, I'm a clinical social worker and therapist here in Minnesota. And where I focus my work now is around the human-animal bond in the veterinary field. And so, as Nicole said, things that I work on are things like compassion fatigue and moral stress, mental health and wellness. Also a lot around animal-related grief and loss is, of course, for the clients that you serve. There's also some other areas of interest for me around the human-animal bond, and that's the link between animal violence and human violence in the home. And then prior to my social work days, I had a lot of experience and training around organizational culture and organizational development and intervention, as well as communication and facilitation. And so I do some of that work as well. In the vet community. So the bulk of the work that I do with my company here, Crockford Consulting, is CE, like we're doing today. So coming to clinics and doing training. And then I also do some work with clinics around that organizational culture piece. And some of you may know me from my full-time gig. I am also the social worker at the Animal Emergency and Referral Center in Minnesota here in the cities. So that's enough about me and my professional background. I think the next slide will be much more interesting to you. As a social worker, you know, I focus on people, and that's really my area of interest. And I learn a lot about other people by the people company they keep. And I think that you all learn a lot about people by the animal company that they keep. So here's my full disclosure. You can make of it what you will. This is my animal family. The two on the top, Shalimar, she is my 26-year-old, she'll be 27 next year, a thoroughbred Clydesdale mare that I've had since she was 3, so we've been together quite a long time. And Finnegan, the little kitty there, he's 2.5. He is the newest member of our family. And then the two on the bottom are two of my heart pets that have passed on. So Murray, the furry gray kitty there, was almost 20 years old when he passed. And Max, the Great Dane, lived to a ripe old age of 8. So I say I like them big and furry. Make of that what you will. All right, enough about me. Let's talk about why we're here today. So again, we're going to be talking about the experience of this pandemic through a wellness lens. And I'm hoping to introduce you to kind of some new things that maybe you haven't thought about. We've all gotten inundated with information on different things to think about and ways to look at this. And I'm hoping to share with you a couple more. Of course, no one living is an expert in pandemics except for perhaps a historical lens. So what I'd like to also do is invite you guys into this conversation. So periodically on slides, you're going to see this image, the chat box, and I'm going to ask you to provide some feedback on your experiences and things you can share so we can all learn together from one another. So I invite you to take a moment right now to find where your chat box is on your computer within the WebEx system. For some folks, it's going to be on the bottom. For others, it's on the top. Kind of move your cursor around until you find it, and you can even keep it open. Like I've got it open on my other screen here so I can see what's popping up for folks. Like right now, we have somebody who is saying that they have no sound. And so I'm not sure if that's on their end or my end. Nicole, can you let me know if it's something
It's
that
on her end. I'm trying to
on
help her
her
out right
end?
now.
Oh, okay, thank you. So as you can see, as you pop things up in the chat, I can see it, Nicole can see it, and you all can see it as well. You'll be able to see other people's comments, and that's what I'm hoping is that we can share together these experiences, and I'll learn from one another. So like I said, we're going to look at this through a grief lens, which I think might be new for some of you, and how we can build upon that and use that in order to process in a new way. So let's start out with us as individuals. So there's a lot of things that goes into individual wellness. As you can see from my graphic here, there's all these different pieces of the pie that make up how we feel and experience the world, and also how we feel and experience this pandemic. So if we start at the top, with vocational, because obviously we're all here in a work setting, our vocation, our job has been greatly impacted, of course. We're doing curbside care. Clients are having to call. We've had to engage new systems like text messaging or other things that we haven't done before. We're wearing face masks, all these different things that have been impacted by the pandemic in our work. But we're also having wellness through our intellectual component. So the things that we're thinking and learning and doing. Are we taking in more information? Are we having to use different information? Are we mentally exhausted from this? Our identity. So if we were all together in person, I'd probably take a poll of a raise of hands of how many of you strongly identify with being a vet or a tech or a veterinary professional. And I would be willing to wager most of you would raise your hand. I would too. I strongly identify with my profession as being a social worker. And those things can be greatly impacted during this time. Our physical health, that's been the topic of conversation, of course. Are we going to get sick? We're all hyper attuned right now to every time we sneeze or cough, get a tickle in our throat, things we would have just dismissed and maybe not even noticed prior to the beginning of this year. Our sense of purpose. If we have had to adjust our identity, our vocation, or other aspects of our life, our sense of purpose might be greatly affected. And while many of us might strongly identify with our vocation, other aspects of our life might give us purpose as well, like who we are to other people. In our family, do we identify strongly as being a parent, whether that's of furry four-legged pets or of two-legged children? Do we identify strongly as being a community member or a volunteer? There's all these different ways that we get identity as well as purpose that are impacted right now. For example, if you enjoy volunteering at a school, you probably can't do either of those things right now. Moving around our wheel, we have our emotional wellness. This is one I'm a big proponent of course. Our mental health and well-being, that's been greatly impacted by all of the stressors that we're enduring from all the aspects of our life. Spiritual wellness, this can be a religious component, but it's also how we feel grounded in space and time, how we feel connected to one another. This is something that can link also well to our purpose. And then the social component. So this is our individual networks and connections, our family, our friends, our neighborhood, our community, and so on. And all of these different components of wellness add to this list, and this is just a smattering of things that make us feel good and help keep us moving forward in a healthy way, right? The pandemic has maybe affected our optimism. It's completely limited our choices. It's perhaps depleted our energy. Many of us have lost sleep at different points in time for various reasons, and our mindset, our view of the world has been shaken a bit. It might also be a challenge to our morals, our values, and our ethics. So there's all these different components that go into us as a unique individual and our wellness and how we've experienced this pandemic. Now, what I want to do is take you out a layer because we spend a lot of time focused in on self, but we're not in a vacuum. Whereas as an individual, if we take one piece of this pie here and say, geez, you know what? Things at work are really tough. When we're outside of a pandemic, we might be able to lean on these other areas of wellness to lift us up. I'm going to spend some time meditating tonight and really beef up my spiritual wellness to kind of compensate for the experience of work being really tough. Right? Or maybe I'm going to get together with some friends. I might go for a walk in nature, things that we would normally do to kind of balance out any one day, week, or month where we're struggling in an area or two. It's hard because everything's being impacted right now. So when we take that out a layer and outside of us as a unique individual, we see there's all these different systems that are at play as well. And these systems that we might rely on have also been impacted by the pandemic. So again, this is just an example. There's a lot more systems than are listed here, but the community and activities that we engage in for our wellness, right? We can't maybe go to the gym or get our hair done or volunteer, things we would maybe like to do. Our sense of safety has been disrupted. Things we would normally do easily or take for granted, like go to the grocery store or to Target, we're having second thoughts about, right? Our finances might be in jeopardy, particularly if we've had any changes in our job or those of our loved ones who live with us or extended family. Our housing might be at jeopardy, as well as our employment has shifted, as we've talked about all these adaptations we've made for our clients, for our team members, for our organization. School, for those of you with kids, this has been a huge fluctuating, ambiguous thing. As we've moved through the year, are we in school? Are we out of school? Is school virtual? How do we connect that with our employment and our finances? You start to see how all of these things are interconnected and play upon one another. And then, of course, we have family and friends, that social component yet again. And it starts to feel a little overwhelming because, again, the things we rely on to lift us up are all impacted as well. This sounds very doom and gloom. I promise we're going to get to the good stuff in a minute. And I want to take you one more layer out. And that is just to show you in this image here that every other person is going through this too. So each of these circles on the outside represents another person who's got all of their individual components that they rely on for wellness that are being impacted, and they're relying on the same systems that we are. So in one hand, it means that everyone is feeling the stress, and we know that. On the other hand, everyone is feeling this stress, and so we sort of get it. We get what each other is going through, and that's actually a benefit we're going to talk about in a little bit. Some of the other forces that are at work while we're experiencing this are big and small, right? Starting out big, we've got the federal government making laws or recommendations. We've got a COVID task force. We've got people making vaccine for us at this large federal and even global scale, right? Then we move down to states. Each state is doing things differently. Even locally, if you've been paying attention to the news over the weekend, Hudson in Wisconsin, just over the border, was making some changes based on what was happening in their community because of what Minnesota did with regards to their regulating of bars and closing things early. We move on into our neighborhood communities. In my community, we've had different community members come together to either help older folks get food earlier in the pandemic or doing runs to the pharmacy in order to get prescriptions for those folks. Businesses have had to make just huge changes, and some have unfortunately had to close because of this. Our schools, as we've talked about, have shifted and shifted and shifted again. And work, we've made all these kinds of impacts to or changes to address the needs of health and safety and wellness while still maintaining our core values of trying to provide the service that we love. Then we've got our family views and beliefs, right? We have family members, some who won't wear a mask, some who will wear a mask. We have folks who believe the pandemic is real, folks that don't believe the pandemic is real, folks who are worried about the vaccine, wondering if it's safe, and folks who are really committed to engaging with that. And then even underneath your family, then we've got you. And what do you think? And how do you feel? And where do you put that? Now, again, these are all these different forces that are at work. And the unfortunate thing I have to show you is this. The thing you have control over, just the bottom of the list, right? It's you. Now, there's a lot of power in that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that can make us feel overwhelmed right now is the fact that there's all these moving parts and pieces. There's all these changes that impact us and that we have to adjust to that we don't have control over. The thing we have control over is us. And that loss of control is the first loss that we're going to talk about today. So let's shift gears for just a minute and let's talk about this lens of loss and grief in terms of the pandemic. So here's a definition for loss. There's many out there, but it's a real perceived deprivation of something deemed meaningful. Oftentimes we think about loss as a death. It's also so many other things that aren't quite as concrete and easy to see as that ending of a death, such as a family member or a pet. So we've got things like stages of life changes as we move, as children grow up, we have the loss of their youth and those experiences. As we age, we might have a loss of mobility or function, the things that we can do, the things that we can't do. We have endings, just normal life endings, ending school when you left vet school or tech school. Relationship ends, whether it's ending of a friendship or a romantic relationship, moving to a new home or a new town. Those are all losses we experience. Changes in job, family, community, big and little things. And what's interesting about loss is it's unique to each individual person and the perspective you have. For example, if the internet goes out in your home, that might be a big loss for you or a little loss for you. I'm getting your kids might actually think it's the end of the world if the internet goes out, right? Because they can't stream their favorite things and play their online games. So this experience of loss, this perceived deprivation, there again, that's that perspective. So I perceive that I'm being deprived of something that's really meaningful to me. So what I want to do, oops, sorry, too many computers here, is take a minute, so in your chat box, and I want you to share with everyone what you feel comfortable about some of the loss of you have experienced during the pandemic. So what are the things you've been deprived of that you felt were really meaningful to you that you're noticing has impacted you this year? So go ahead and pop some of those into the chat and we'll share those with the group. So I'm seeing meeting with friends. Yeah, that's a big loss. Being able to get together with friends and families for the holidays, right? This is a recent and upcoming loss for those of you celebrating Christmas or New Year's. Yoga classes. Yeah, there's that physical health piece. That might also be a connecting piece if you're doing class with people you like. Friends, again, yeah, there's this big social component that we've lost, and physical touch, right? I'm a hugger. I would love to hug my family right now and not able to do that. Oh, Meredith, we're on the same wavelength here. Meredith just chimed in with hugs. Yes, absolutely. And we just had in our family, a new addition last week to our family and would love to hug and hold that little baby. a grandparent, and a hug. Yeah, so it sounds like this group is really focused on that social and emotional connection with other people. And you're right, that is an absolutely huge loss. Great nieces and nephews. Yeah, hugging friends, going out, absolutely. Great job, everyone. So some other losses that I just want to share that we might experience, since you guys are really focused on the social component, is great. And I've got that on here too, right? That connection, that physical contact. But we've also had a loss in our stability and our control that we've talked about. We've had our routine upended, and this can kind of cause loss in our sense of balance, our sense of health, our sense of safety, right? Oh, Mary, I'm so sorry. She said that she had a classmate pass away. Hugging friends, going out. Yeah, absolutely, Leah, that's right. A loss in our rituals and traditions. Someone mentioned the holidays, and not even just our spiritual or traditions, but also our daily traditions and rituals, part of our routines that we have. Caitlin says the loss of sharing firsts with my 11-month-old with family. Absolutely, Caitlin. Like I said, it's such a strange thing to have a family member be born and not go to the hospital and immediately be able to, share that joy and that love with everyone. So there's been just quite a lot of loss. And when we think about that, we also see that there are layers to our loss when we're talking about a pandemic. And the one that comes to mind most for me is called ambiguous loss. And when we think about ambiguous loss, this is loss that occurs without any kind of closure or clear understanding. There's this lack of clarity. So in vet med, when we have a death of a companion animal, right, a client's pet dies, there's some clarity around this loss because we can see it, right? The pet was there and now the pet is dead. We can see the deceased animal. It's very clear. With ambiguous loss, this becomes uncomfortable because there's so much uncertainty. And in the pandemic, we've got a ton of that, right? We've got a lot of uncertainty. So where ambiguous loss pops up in vet med, which you've all experienced, is if we have a lost or a stolen pet. So the pet is physically absent, but psychologically for the client, that pet is still very present and we don't know what happened, right? Also, if there's a family change, so let's say there's a divorce or people separate and the pet goes with one parent and not the other, right? There's an ambiguous loss for the parent that no longer gets to be with that pet. Giving a pet up to shelter, right? That unknown of what's going to happen to that pet, or a pet moving from a foster home. For those of you who are fosters to a forever home, there can be some ambiguous loss there if they don't get any updates from the forever home. For those who have animals that are working, whether they are therapy animals or support service working animals, when those animals retire from doing the work, there's ambiguous loss for the clients that were experiencing that animal. So there's lots of ways that we see this in vet med. So how does this pop up for us in the pandemic? Gotta do one more. There we go. In the pandemic, we see things where, the store is present, but it's not open. Maybe this is a dining establishment. We can see it, but we can't experience it, right? So there's the present physical presence, but the psychological absence. I'm in school, but I can't go to school. And so there is a potential ambiguous loss there and the uncertainty of when we could re-engage with school. Some can work and others can't work. I've heard this come up as well, where folks in vet med are sometimes a little jealous of those who have been able to stay home and clean out their closets and redo their kitchen, while at the same time, those people are jealous of folks in vet med who still get to go to work every day. So there's this ambiguous loss around, I don't understand, it's not clear why some people do this and others do that. And so we feel this sense of loss. We don't have a clear timeline, although it's getting clearer about when we're going to return to normal and really what will normal be. And then there's this loss of our personal and professional identity that we have been experiencing, again, around all those wellness pieces, right? Who we are, what does it mean? How have we experienced ourselves in this past year? And what will that look like? And how will it impact me moving forward? These are all the different ways that we experience ambiguous loss in the pandemic. And we know about the experience of loss is that when there's loss, there's grief. And what grief is an emotion that's generated by an experience of loss. And it's typically characterized by sorrow or distress. At least that's the way we often think about it. We think about it like this gentleman in the picture here who looks very sad and maybe a bit overwhelmed, maybe a bit confused. The other thing that I know about grief is that it's not something that we experience alone. It's both personal and interpersonal. And so we experience this in the context of the people we care about, the systems around us. And I know as you all in vet med have experienced the loss of a companion animal, you know that when one pet parent is particularly attached and another pet parent maybe isn't, or their friends or family don't really get the human animal bond, they say hurtful things like, oh, you can just get another pet, right? That's that interpersonal experience of grief, somebody who is kind of disenfranchising your grief or your client's grief because they don't understand. And so we have this both our own unique experience of grief, and we have the experience of grief that comes through interpersonal relationship. As we know, grief is not just being sad. There are so many different ways that grief shows up for folks. And so I've got a list here and they can range the gamut. And we'll see this even within people who are very close or living in the same household will experience grief very differently, right? So this can be things like disbelief or being withdrawn. So the things where we aren't quite ready to accept that experience. We see that in vet med, obviously, when that euthanasia or the death of the pet has just most recently occurred. We all get those sad feelings of depression. We might have disappointment or some guilt. Some folks might feel really angry. They're trying to activate their grief into an emotion they can do something with. You might feel overwhelmed like this gentleman does. And for some folks, grief actually triggers feelings of gratitude, right? They think about the experience of that relationship and how grateful they were to be a part of that. So grief can also elicit loving and peaceful and thankful feelings as well. So grief really does span the gamut, and folks can experience all these different emotions at different times. All right. Now, similarly to loss, where there's layers of loss, there's also layers of grief. So one of the layers that we're seeing with the pandemic is anticipatory grief. And we've been experiencing this all year. In vet med, we see anticipatory grief pop up with pets that are aging, right? As we watch our pets slowly lose things that they were able to do, we start to become aware that death is nearing, and we start to grieve a little bit. We're grieving the loss of the ability to go for long walks. Now we go for short walks, right? When a client is given a terminal diagnosis, they're going to be then potentially engaging in grief at the pending loss, like anticipating what it's going to feel like to not have that pet with them any longer. If there's a critical incident, like the pet's hit by a car, we might get some acute grief, and then again, some anticipatory grief if the prognosis isn't very fair. And then pending separations. So when folks have that ambiguous loss, that can trigger anticipatory grief. And so that moving, the family change, bringing a pet to shelter, people might start to experience those grief symptoms. And we've seen all of this in vet med. So let's take a look at how this translates into the pandemic. So of course, we have got tons of uncertainty right now. And again, remember with ambiguous loss, that's that uncertain, we don't know what it looks like, we can't get our hands around it. And so it's hard to know what to do with that. That can trigger these anticipatory grief symptoms. We've got the thought of potential health issues, right? Oh, is that tickle in my throat something to be worried about? Or do I just have a tickle in my throat? The potential loss of life. You know, if we know anyone who gets sick or we're worried about us getting sick or the people around us getting sick, the potential loss of a job. Now, we've been fortunate in vet med that I think most of us have been able to continue to engage in work in some way. But if we did get sick, what would that mean for work? The community losses have been huge, right? We've had businesses shut down and restaurants and bars not be able to be open. There's so many different ways that we're engaging in the community that we didn't get to do before. And we don't know when and if we'll be able to do that again. You know, you might have a favorite restaurant that you're just wondering, gosh, are they going to be able to hang in there? Are they going to have to close? Will my gym be able to stay there? I really like that hot yoga class. And so we're having this anticipation, of that loss, and then we might grieve a bit. That's where those feelings can come in. And when we're thinking about this, again, we've been talking about this on an individual level, but remember those layers that we had in that earlier picture. So there was us and those systems, and then everybody else, right? And that's what I want to draw your attention to next, is that we are experiencing collective loss and collective grief. Now, we're accustomed to loss and grief as individuals, families, small groups, our neighborhood, our vet community, right? We all understand similar things in these different groups that we're a part of. But we've never really experienced collective loss and collective grief on a global scale. Even when we think about natural disasters or 9/11, those tend to be country, region specific, right? And this is global. Everyone is going through this together. And so this can impact us in several different ways. Our faith in our systems, like we were maybe feeling really confident about our healthcare system, and now we're wondering, gosh, why weren't we better prepared for this? It kind of feels like, again, another ambiguous loss. Our understanding of the world and how it worked. Why does the UK get to have the vaccine before us? These might be questions we ask. Feelings of predictability and control. Remember that slide where I said the only thing you have control over is you? Well, oftentimes we kind of get a fake sense of control because other people are handling things, and we feel that that is really solid for us. Our sense of justice. How is this fair, right? And our ability to protect those who are vulnerable, whether it's our elderly or our children. And the reason why this is important is because it changes the rules about how we cope and where we turn to heal, right? Our ability to address loss and embrace our grief feelings get really challenged when everybody's experiencing the same thing. It also is, and I like to see every challenge as an opportunity. And this is an opportunity for depth of empathy and understanding, because we can actually heal together. And that's what I'd like us to spend the rest of our time together talking about. Right, so grief, believe it or not, actually has some purpose, and some really good purpose that helps us move forward and heal. So recognizing grief actually helps in our healing process. What grief is, we experience an emotion, we're like, gosh, what is this? And if we can say, I am grieving, it's an indicator that we've experienced a loss. And that signals that we may need to adapt to the loss. This is one of the ways that we move through grief. It's called loss adaptation. It's an active process. We actually have to engage in it. It's not something that happens to us. It's something that we do for ourselves and for each other. And it's this process of adjusting to loss and grief over time. And so there's lots of different ways that we engage in loss adaptation. If we think about vet med, I'm going to ask this question to you in a minute to pop in the chat box. We help owners adapt to pet loss all the time. There's lots of different things. They might have to modify things or revise things. We have to reorganize our thoughts and our way of being and kind of assimilate into this new adaptation, this new way of being where we incorporate the loss and our grief into our lives. And so let's think about it in vet med for a minute. Let's get grounded in things we know before we talk about how this looks in a pandemic. So here's my question for you to pop in the chat box. So when you've engaged with your clients or your colleagues, because you're all card-carrying members of the pet community, right? How have you helped yourself or others adapt to pet loss? What kinds of things did you encourage them to do or think about? Go ahead and pop those into the chat and we'll share with each other. Okay, we've got reach out to others who've gone through similar things. Yep, to share stories. Yep, stories are great. Stories, pictures. Mary says we have a handout, so something that provides some concrete information. I usually ask pet owners about specific experiences with their pet they find most memorable. Yeah, Liana, that is really great to help them connect and remember the things that they love. Lisa uses Lap of Love. They're a great organization. Some of the other things I think about when we talk about pet loss is the rituals that we do in human loss, right? Like we have a memorial service for folks or a celebration of life ceremony. And I encourage pet owners to do things like that. They have to adapt their routines, right? We might not have to take a dog for a walk or give a medication or feed a particular pet. Having those memorials, so the picture, the paw print, the photo book, the garden stone, all these different ways that we memorialize helps us to reorganize how we feel about the pet and adapt that loss, assimilate it into our lives, right? The other thing that we need to do is engage the grief and allow space for grief. And that's what we want to talk about next. So within the pandemic, as within any experience of grief and loss, naming it and claiming it can give us some power. Words hold weight, and anyone who has experienced mental health can tell you it doesn't work for everyone, but sometimes having that label of knowing, oh, this is what this thing is that I'm feeling. I can wrap my hands around it. Now I can do something about it. We call that giving ourselves agency. We can reclaim our control, and then we can move ourselves forward. There's a quote, and I wish I knew who said it because I love it. It's emotions need motion. We actually have to engage in our emotions in order to move them forward. So I want to talk about one of the ways that we can think about engaging grief and what grief looks like. And you've seen this, but I want to give you again some agency to understand what it is and how you can use this now. And it's called the dual process model of grief. I'm sure you guys have heard of like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of grief. I find those things are great. I find this a little bit more useful, and it seems to be what I see folks experience when they experience grief and loss. And that's where we kind of move back and forth in no particular order between experiencing these grief symptoms and then doing other things or not experiencing grief symptoms. So we call this loss orientation versus restoration orientation. And we kind of go back and forth. And so we might be really sad, and then we're going to go to work. And then we might be kind of denying and avoiding engaging in those loss adaptation strategies. And then we might go into watching a Netflix series, right? We go back and forth from these things and fluctuate between moments of sadness and mourning and moments of acceptance and even happiness. Resilience is built moving in and out of these states and having flexibility. Otherwise, people get stuck, right? If they just say instead or angry or denial, they don't move through their grief, they get stuck. And so we need to help each other do this in order to be successful, right? Our emotions need motion. We need to move back and forth. And I do want to just say again that it's really important and even healthy to be distracted at sometimes. We don't want to sit in that grief because we don't want to get stuck all the time. But it's also even okay to be entertained and to laugh and to engage in those happy times as well. Some people feel like, oh, I have to sit in my grief and feel sad all the time. That's not really how grief works. We move and oscillate between these things. Grief is also unique to every individual. And we see this pop up in loss adaptation on this kind of continuum. We all have sort of a natural way that we engage the world. That might be where we default to when we experience this grief and loss. It might be more of an intuitive style where we're experiencing emotions and affect is how we move through our grief. Or we might be more of an instrumental style where we use cognitive and physical ways that to experience our grief. So through activities or thoughts. Adaptive strategies like these are used to manage or express our natural response to loss. What's interesting is some of us might have a blended style, and some of us might use the exact same strategy, but for different purposes. So someone mentioned telling stories, which is a great one. And telling a loss story may help intuitive grievers over here on the left-hand side connect emotionally, and may help instrumental style grievers gather information and sort of solve problems, that cognitive process. So there's lots of different ways that we might adapt to the loss and move through our grief using these adaptive strategies to adapt to that loss. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how we move through our grief. Now, in social work, we love to, as I say, take challenges and turn them into opportunities. We call it the social work reframe. So remember earlier, and we were feeling kind of overwhelmed by this list of all the things that we don't have control over, right? There's just this one thing at the bottom that you have control over. Here's my reframe on this. This control that you have over you, it's actually your superpower. And there's so much more agency we have in this. You can take back control and think about all of the things that you actually can do instead of focusing on the things that you can't. You know, we've talked about these things ad nauseum already, right? Washing our hands, wearing a mask, social distancing. Things we've already done that we aren't giving ourselves credit for is all the things we've done to learn how to work differently. Maybe we've started to appreciate takeout food or delivery where we didn't do that before. We can support local businesses instead of worrying about whether or not this store down the street will be open. We can go support it and help take an active part in relieving not only our anticipatory loss or ambiguous loss and anticipatory grief, but helping support that business, right? We can take breaks from the news. That's healthy for all of us. Ground ourselves in the present, and we can plan for the future. So I want to take a minute and check in with all of you about what are the can-do things that you've engaged in? Let's help each other build on our toolbox, the superpower of you. What are the things that you have done to take back that control and flip this challenge into an opportunity? Go ahead and pop those in the chat now. Exercise. That's a great one, Mary. Yeah, engaging in those physical wellness and coping strategies. That's a wonderful superpower. Switching to working at home and wearing masks at work. Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. I think a lot of folks were really nervous about working at home, myself included. You know, how will this work? How will I connect with people as a social worker where I'm used to seeing you all like today in person and reading your body language, and understanding if where we're going is working for you, if we need to shift gears. So working from home presented a whole new set of ways of thinking about it. And some of us now are embracing it and even finding joy in that we get to spend more time with our family or throw in a little laundry when we take a break from the work that we're doing. Let's see what else. Scheduling time to FaceTime with all of my family. Yeah, Caitlin, maybe we are learning about new ways to connect with people that we hadn't done before. I know myself at the hospital where I work, we've done pet loss group there once a month in person for a long time, and we switched it to Zoom, and that seems to work really well for the families, which is fantastic. I was super apprehensive because, again, I like to connect with all of you in person. But the clients were really excited to be in their own homes where they were comfortable and have to travel. They got to be around the items of their pets that they loved. So that was really great. Exercise at home on Zoom. And there's a quote, fascination. I'm not sure if that's a particular thing. Mary, you'll have to let us know. Getting back to our roots, spending more time as a close-knit family. A lot of folks are really reframing their priorities. And not that family wasn't a priority, but they are seeing what they were missing by being gone and that they're starting to restructure how they think about that. That's amazing. More time outdoors and the activities we don't always make time for, right? So finding new things that fill up your cup. Finding new ways to communicate fully with clients through more time on the phone, emails, photos, etc. That's great, Nancy. That's right. We've all had to adapt, and we might have seen that initially as a challenge, but now we're learning, wow, sending a photo to a client of a pet that is either in the back or they're not with can really go a long way to manage and maintain that human-animal bond with their pet, but then also your relationship with them. Zoom lunch. And Mary says, yes, fascination is a kind of exercise. Well, Mary, you have piqued my interest. I am not familiar with that one. And I've reconnected with family members and neighbors due to concerns on how they're doing, right? So yeah, so that's great, Nancy. You're engaging in that community, that social aspect of wellness in a new way. You guys are just boosting your resiliency to this grief and loss with each of these ideas. And I hope in hearing some of the others that you might now try some of their strategies as well. Like Mary, I am going to Google fascination as an exercise as soon as we're done with this training because I'm very curious. So that's wonderful. So I want you to really think about how you can reframe this thought of this loss of control that we have been experiencing in the pandemic into a strength, all the things that you can do in order to take back your control, give yourself agency, and help move you through your grief. I want to share some other tools, and you may have seen these before, but I didn't want to let these slide by since I have the opportunity to share them with the group. These are from the Mayo Clinic, and these are different coping strategies for pandemic loss that they have been sharing throughout the year. The first one is really to pay attention to your feelings. So we're learning today and exploring this through this grief lens and giving them space and leaning into them. So not kind of that avoidance strategy of, nope, I don't have time to feel sad. I don't have time to feel worried. But actually giving yourself the opportunity to lean in and take space and engage those feelings is really important in order to move through them. Sometimes it can be helpful to write these things down, perhaps in a journal. Thinking about your strengths and coping skills. So we just had a lovely list in the chat of some of the different things that people are doing. But one way to think about this is to reflect on times where you've had other challenges in life, whether it was a tough transition, like a job change or a divorce. And what did you do in those things during those times that helped you recover? Now, some of those might be things that aren't available to you right now, right? Like maybe going to the gym. But as Mary pointed out, hey, we could exercise on Zoom. So there's new ways. Again, if we think about what can we do or how could this be possible? So I need to exercise and I can't do this, but I can do fill in the blank, right? How do we adapt those strengths and those coping skills in order to fit the situation we're in right now? Staying connected. This is huge. And I think this group already knows that from the list of the things that you gave me when we talked about loss, right? So what are the different ways we can stay connected? Phone calls, text messages, video chats, social media, all these different ways. And reaching out to those in similar situations. I think one person, I'm not sure who it was in the chat, had said that they started connecting with neighbors and other folks that they maybe hadn't connected with in the same way to check in and see how they're doing. That's going to be hugely important as we continue to move through next year. And then limiting your news intake. Obviously, in the beginning, we were all craving this news to understand, and it can be hard to stop that. But when we take breaks from the news, just like when we take breaks from our grief, it actually helps us feel healthier and well. A few more of the pandemic loss coping strategies from Mayo Clinic. Create an adapted routine. Isn't this great? The Mayo Clinic understands this loss adaptation is also important in routine adaptation. So creating a new routine can help us preserve a sense of order and purpose. So if we used to get up in the morning and go to the gym, maybe we get up in the morning and go for a walk, or maybe we do something different. But creating an actual new routine can be helpful and give us that sense of agency and control. In addition to work online or learning activities that might help you cope, such as exercise, worship, or hobbies, we've talked about those, and sleep and a healthy diet. Those are things that always help us feel better. Taking comfort in creativity. I know some folks have tried new hobbies like crocheting or knitting, things that or learn about from the internet or through a book. Some folks have started to cook, or when it was nicer out, we did a lot of gardening. Creativity in all its forms can be a really healing process. And then lastly, I want us to think about how we remember the journey. So considering some of the good memories that you have built, or what have you learned about yourself, your clinic? What do you appreciate that you didn't before? And what things might you continue that are new that you've learned about in the pandemic? And so I want to spend a minute in the chat for you guys to share some of those things. So share a few things, something you've learned, something you appreciate that you didn't before, or something that you will continue to do once the pandemic is over that you didn't do before. Lisa says, excuse me, going for walks over lunch with my puppy I got during the pandemic. Oh, so we've got a new family member and taking that family member for walks. That's wonderful. Ooh, I learned to play the kalimba. Awesome, Rebecca. A new hobby and engaging in music. What a creative process. That's great. All right, if this is a hard one for folks, then I challenge you to give you this as homework. This can be hard. It is one of the ways that we strongly build resiliency when we experience loss, is to think about good things, the big picture, what we've learned and what we appreciate about things. It's a little bit like in vet med when we say goodbye to a pet, right? Everyone's focused on the death, on the last minutes or days or maybe weeks, and not focused on the journey they've had with that pet. From getting the pet as a kitten or a puppy, all the wonderful experiences and outings and laughter and joy. And those are the things that we as professionals think about and want to remind our clients about, that it's not just this one moment of profound sadness and loss. It's the entire relationship. It's that entire bond and continuing that bond as they move through their life, right? It's the same for pandemic loss and coping. We have to look at the big picture. You know, did you have some great moments being quarantined at home? Did you find a funny Netflix show and you watched it at the same time as your friend in another state to connect and giggle through text messages about what was happening, right? What are the things you've learned at your clinic? Maybe you really like that you send pictures to your clients or text messaging, different ways to communicate that might have connected you with clients you didn't get to connect with before. And maybe some of those things will continue. So there is good within this, and finding that is healing and helps build your resiliency. Okay, so I want to take us back out, and let's not forget about these horrible systems that are shouting at us. Right? So those systems of school and work and community, those forces of federal and state and local laws, all of these things are still going to be impacting you. And as you can see, this lady here on the left is getting kind of anxious or worried by these impacts of being shouted at. So these impacts are still going to be there. And we need to pay attention to how we engage them and how they change our experience. And remember that we need to let go of what we can't control, focus on what we can. And when we feel like this woman does in the picture, where we're a bit discombobulated, a bit overwhelmed, we start to feel that spinny loss of control. Take a moment to ground yourself in the present moment wherever you are. This is not something that's complex. It can be as simple as breathing and just focusing on your breath, noticing it going in and out. Notice the rise and fall of your chest. You can also do things more actively, like focus on the space right now where you're sitting. Name 5 things you can see. You know, for me, a desk, a chair, the computer, a plant. You might have a dog or a cat in your room with you. Engaging your other senses is a great way to ground yourself, whether you actively seek out, you know, a good smelling something, or you just notice what you smell, what you can taste in the room where you're sitting. You can also use a mantra. Tell yourself, this is temporary. Or another mantra that might work for you. It's good to say these things out loud, not just in your head. Again, that grounds you in the present moment and gives you some perspective, helps you regain control over what you have control over, which is, of course, you. The last thing that I want to leave you with today is to remind you that we heal in community, and healing takes time. So as we move into 2021 and with the promise of a vaccine and the hope that that folks will engage with that and we will heal physically from this pain and this loss and this grief, the impacts of this year are going to continue past the time that everyone on the planet is vaccinated. And so ongoing social supports are really key. Those of you who are checking in with others, keep checking in. Maintain those supports as we engage in our new normal. You know, however we come out of this, we're going to feel excited. We're going to be glad to get back to things that we were doing or creating a new path. But there's still folks who are going to be experiencing the impacts of both their individual wellness and those system impacts as well. You know, there's an emotional toll. There's maybe financial, those who've lost jobs. And as we engage in these change processes across systems or within ourselves and our families, there's going to be impacts there too. And I can give you a little bit of an analogy. When we experience human death, you know, we typically, at least in the Western community, generally will have some sort of a service, whether it's a funeral or a celebration of life ceremony. It usually happens within the first week or two of someone's passing. And everyone kind of rushes in and supports the individual or family that's lost their loved one. We have this service, and then everyone goes back to their life. Well, that individual or that family is still grieving. And more often than not, by the time the funeral has happened, they might still be in that shock, denial, disbelief phase of their grief. And so needing that community will be important after the funeral and for a long time coming. But sometimes it's easy for the rest of us to kind of walk away and go back to our normal life. This is going to be the same as we heal from the pandemic. The impacts of this are going to last and linger long past the physical ending of the pandemic. And so connecting and re-engaging and supporting one another is going to be key to make sure that we all heal after the pandemic as well. All right, well, I think I got 1 minute left, it looks like. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to hang out. Feel free to post them in the chat. Also, this is how you can find me, and you're always welcome to contact me about this or anything. I'm happy to help if I can, and if I can't, I'm also happy to connect you to those who can. So feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and feelings with others in the chat. Again, we heal together and we learn from one another. So I appreciate your grace in sharing some of your experiences with the group. So have a wonderful day. And again, I'll hang out in case anyone has questions.
Well, thank you, Colleen, so much for all this wonderful information. I found your voice so soothing. I think I'm going to have you record a relaxation tape for me so I can play at night. As she mentioned, Colleen is willing to hang out. If there are any questions, please just go ahead and type them in. I know many of you have to get back to work, so that's understandable. I'm looking to see if I see any. But thank you also, attendees, for joining us today. I know everybody's very busy. This is a busy time of year for everyone, and so stay safe in your clinics. And so if you need to log off, that's understandable. We'll give people just a second here if they do have any questions.
Absolutely. And if you don't have time, again, you can email me or call anytime. Oops.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And Colleen, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful day. Bye, Nicole.
Bye. Talk to you soon.
Okay.